Wait just 1 second. There we go. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the archives. As many of you may know, my name is Nishla. If you're new here, this channel is a long-form... Oh, sorry. This channel is a home for long-form storytelling, deep lore, and the quiet work of building worlds that feel lived in. Storytime is very much at the heart of that. It's one of the main ways that I share the stories that live here and the ways that I invite people into them. A great deal of what I write is rooted in an ongoing Star Wars fanfiction universe that has grown over many years, one chapter, one thread, and one piece of lore at a time. Oops, sorry. Okay. So when we gather here for Storytime, which we're doing tonight, we're not only opening up a single story, we're stepping into a much larger world. A world shaped by memory, culture, language, duty, grief, love, history, and all the quiet details that give a story its weight. That's honestly one of the things that I love most about long-form storytelling. It allows a world to deepen, it lets the characters change over time, and it lets the relationships gather history. And it lets the lore become something more than just background detail. It becomes part of the emotional structure of the story itself, part of what the people carry, part of what they inherit, and part of what gives meaning to the choices that they make. And that's very much what the archives are meant to be. Not only a channel, but a shared space. A place to linger in a story, and to spend time with the people, the histories, and the worlds that unfold here in the archives. Whether you've been following these stories for a long time, or you're just arriving, you're welcome. Alright, my friends. I apologize for not being here on Wednesday. Weather's been a bit weird, so my internet was not behaving. But here we are. It's Friday evening. Friday, July 3rd, and yes, I know that there's probably fireworks for many of you if you're here in the US, so I will try to be done before those start, hopefully. Can't promise anything. I do hope that you guys are staying cool. It has been absolutely ridiculous here this week as far as temperatures go. I don't want to talk about it. Just hot. Just very hot. I have my AC going, so if you randomly hear that in the background, even with my noise gating, that's probably why. Because it's ridiculous. Okay, tonight we are continuing with Steps into the Past, Chapter 24, The Quiet Bulwark, which continues Marin's journey following Druckenwell. It's a lot more of a quieter chapter. There is a bit more dialogue than there was in Chapter 23, just so you know. Chapter 23 was rough because there really wasn't much dialogue to speak of. There was communication, sure, but there wasn't much actual dialogue, so it was a bit challenging for me also. So there's a bit more this evening, and it's a bit of a quieter chapter, kind of like 23 was. So I'm hoping that you find it enjoyable and a good place to spend your evening. For those of you who are here, whether you're looking or actually here in chat, thank you for being here, especially on the evening of July the 4th. And get comfortable. Get yourself some cool water, a snack, a blanket if you're cold, because it might be colder where you're, I don't know. It's hot where I am, so. Alright. I'm going to be reading from the actual document this evening because my prompter is misbehaving as it tends to. So we are just going to not mess around with that this evening and just read straight from our document. So if you see me doing that, that's entirely what I'm doing. Alright. Okay. Get some water before we start here. Also, please let me know if the music is too loud on your end and you are having trouble hearing me. I've actually turned it down in my headphones, but I have been told a few times that it has been a little bit quiet. So do let me know if you can't hear it. It's mostly for background. So, just a general PSA. Alright. Steps into the Past, Chapter 24. The Quiet Bulwark. Lines in the dark. Tanagas 5, Durza Estate, War Room. They had put the last several hours to good use, though usefulness had not made the hours any lighter. Marin lay deeper within the mountain in the emberlock chamber, still held in the steady rhythm of a healing trance beneath Callista's watch, while the rest of them worked the estate into readiness around her. Jarius had built the Durza estate like a fortress, shaping stone, corridors, thresholds, and sightlines with the mind of a man who understood that a home in dangerous territory had to be more than just shelter. Every arch had been placed with defense in mind. Every approach could be narrowed, sealed, or watched. Reinforced plating lay hidden beneath carved stone and old timbers, and the mountain itself had been drawn into the design as if Jarius had persuaded it to guard his family after he no longer could. Yet Ethan and Greer both knew that even thick walls and carefully layered security would not hold forever if the wrong enemy pressed hard enough. If Kirt Saad came north in force, the estate could be tested beyond anything it had been meant to endure. If even a splinter unit broke from the larger chaos and followed instinct, intelligence, or old obsessions toward the mountains, this house could become a battlefield before dawn. The war room table carried the evidence of that possibility in a disorder that only looked careless from a distance. Blueprints of the estate, its hidden access corridors, along with holographic maps of the surrounding ridges, lay beneath hastily sketched holographic overlays and grease pencil notations that snaked across Jarius's careful lines on the physical maps. Ethan hunched over them with his shoulders squared, studying the maps with the grim concentration of a man who had spent too many years measuring the difference between a defensive plan and the bodies left behind when that plan failed. Outside, traps and mines had been laid in careful arcs through the brush, not in the blunt patterns of a military perimeter, but in the subtler language of someone who knew the land intimately. Sun charges sat wired low where the undergrowth pressed thickest. Hidden pitfalls and deadfall triggers had been placed where an impatient advance would find them before the sensors did. Narrow channels of approach remained open only because Ethan wanted them open. And those paths existed in his mind as clearly as they did on the holographic map. A shield generator would have announced too much. It would have drawn attention, invited analysis, and made the estate look exactly like the kind of bastion an enemy would want to crack. He and Greer had agreed on layered subtlety instead, trusting traps, the terrain, concealed sightlines, and disciplined movement to do what visible strength could not. At the end of the table, Greer sat with a vibroblade balanced across his knees, drawing a whetstone along the edge in slow, even strokes. The rasp of metal against stone filled the room with a rhythm that seemed to belong there. It was neither hurried nor idle, a soldier's meditation carried beneath the weight of planning. He had already reviewed the approach routes twice, confirmed the rotation assignments, and checked in with the outer watchposts through veil channels that left as little trace as possible. The blade didn't need the attention, not really. But the work of sharpening it gave his hands something steady to do while the rest of his mind moved through contingencies. Ethan understood that kind of motion. It was no different from the way he rolled a grease pencil between his fingers when he had already marked every line that could be marked, and still had to wait for the next problem to reveal itself. Greer's gray eyes flicked up at last, measuring Ethan across the table with that directness of long familiarity. "What's on your mind?" The question was direct, his tone firm, but measured. Ethan exhaled through his nose and dragged one hand through graying brown hair before gesturing towards the interior of the estate, toward the protected depth of the mountain where the Emberlock chamber held Marin in a silence none of them liked, but all of them needed. He had been careful since they brought her in, careful with his voice, with his hands, and careful with every order that might carry too much feeling into a room already burdened with it. Here, beneath the quiet scrape of the whetstone and the low hum of the estate systems behind stone walls, some of the restraint thinned around the edges. "She's in no condition for me to even think of sending her into combat." "I know." Greer set the whetstone aside, though the blade remained in his hand. "Callista and I spoke of it briefly on the transit from Catane. We agreed she should serve as coordinator, kept far from the lines." Ethan gave a low grunt that didn't quite become disagreement. His eyes returned to the maps, but the lack of protest told Greer he was listening. Ethan didn't need to be convinced that Callista's judgment mattered. He trusted her more deeply than he would ever announce in a room like this. And that trust had shaped the entire night in ways neither man needed to actually name. Callista had already made clear what Marin could not survive, and Ethan had accepted it because he knew the difference between caution and fear when it came from her. The difficulty lay elsewhere. Marin had been trained by people who had taught her to move toward danger when others stepped back from it, and that training had saved her life more than once. It had also nearly killed her. Captain IT saw to it that the intelligence officer requisitioned a second set of armor for her. Greer continued. His voice carried the flat marine cadence of a report, controlled and practical, though his gray eyes remained steady on Ethan's face. "On paper, it's for comparison testing. In practice, it lets her use the combat overlays, see the feeds, and track positions. She can help me coordinate from here." Ethan's brow furrowed as he stared long and hard at Greer. The idea had merit, which made it all the more dangerous. A useful plan could be dismissed cleanly. A workable one required attention to every flaw that it might conceal. He pictured Marin in the war room rather than the Emberlock chamber, armored enough to use the overlays but still pale beneath the weight of injuries that had not finished healing. He pictured her watching feeds, counting movement, anticipating enemy decisions, then burning through strength she didn't have because she would rather collapse performing a duty than rest while others fought beyond the walls. "Only if the comm is muted," he muttered. "She's not broadcasting a word." "Already done," Greer said. "Comm's locked to receive only. The beacon's disabled as well. Locator dark, no remote monitoring, not even to IT. No one outside this estate gets her signal." "Good." Ethan leaned back in his chair, the pencil rolling once between his fingers before he stilled it against the blueprint that was spread across the table. The answer removed one immediate danger, but not the deeper one still in his mind. He trusted systems only as far as the people who maintained them, and he trusted Marin's stubbornness less than any system in the estate. Then the real fight will be keeping her from trying to take the field herself. She'll want to. She always does. Greer set the blade down on the table with care, placing it where he could still reach it. His gray eyes hardened, not with anger but with recognition. That stubborn streak, along with her father's and your training, is the only reason she lived through Dreckenwell. She's marine tough, but she's got a fixation with Deathwatch whether she admits it or not. They've been hunting her for years, and now we know why. The room seemed to hold the words after he spoke them. Ethan's gaze shifted over the maps without truly seeing the lines for a moment, and in that pause lay everything neither of them had said since Gatane. They knew what it meant for Marin to have been hunted before she understood the shape of it. They knew what it meant for her survival to be tied to old loyalties, old blood, old hatred, and the kind of enemy that didn't forget a target simply because time had passed. Greer's voice quieted before he spoke again, the report cadence giving way to something more personal because the question deserved no pretense. "You're afraid she'll slip out again?" Ethan's silence was his own admission. He didn't look away because there was no point in pretending otherwise with Greer. Both men had spent too long protecting difficult people in impossible circumstances to mistake silence for indifference. His fear didn't come from the lack of trust. In many ways, it came from knowing Marin too well. And I'm going to stop right there. We have an ad starting, my friends. Please go get yourself some water. I will be right back. I think I think I missed my cue to come back from the ad break. My apologies, my friends. I was not watching the chat as closely as I could have been. Welcome back. I do hope you're staying cool and drinking lots of water. And if you feel like drinking other things, that is perfectly acceptable too. Just stay cool. I have some water over here, and I also have some tea over here, which is actually getting cold, but that's okay. Also, there we go. For anybody who is not aware, which is probably all of you, we now have an official archive mascot. As you might notice, I have a little white cat down here in the corner of the screen. Over there. So this is our physical representation of that cat. They are now keeping me company over here on stream. So they're gonna hang out with me. And of course, silently judge me for not getting enough sleep. Although I did get quite a lot last night, in spite of everything going on. I'm gonna back up a couple of sentences here just in case I got cut off because of the ad. His fear did not come from lack of trust. In some ways, it came from knowing Marin too well. He knew the shape of her courage. He knew the speed with which she turned pain into purpose. And he also knew how easily duty could become a blade in her hand even when her own body was the thing being cut by it. It's a valid concern, Greer allowed, and the acknowledgement carried neither dismissal nor reassurance for its own sake. But I doubt it. Card may have had a word with her before we left Gatane. She's been more restrained since. Add the lingering injury she's carrying and the task we've set here. He gestured toward the maps and toward the empty chair waiting beside the repeater, where the lines of the defensive plan converged into a position close enough for Callista to supervise, and far enough from the doors to keep Marin out of any immediate combat. She won't have the chance, and she'll know it. Yay! Welcome in! Oh, hi MC Fat Cat. I did not recognize the account. Welcome in. I hope you're staying cool down there in Florida. There we go. Oh, I haven't played that in a hot minute, actually. I play it periodically when there is new content, which I believe that there is, so I need to go poke at that. But yes, one of my favorite games and one that I do play periodically, so have fun with that. I am reading this evening. Currently we are in chapter 24 of Steps into the Past, titled The Quiet Bulwark. There we go. He gestured toward the maps and toward the empty chair waiting beside the repeater, where the lines of the defensive plan converged into a position close enough for Callista to supervise and far enough from the doors to keep Marin out of any immediate combat. She won't have the chance, and she'll know it. She won't like it, Ethan said after a long pause. His brown eyes tracked the notations on the holographic map again, following mines, arcs of fire, and narrow corridors of escape as though the land could tell him whether the plan would hold, once fear and blaster fire complicated it. But she'll do her duty. He tapped the pencil once against the table, not hard enough to snap it, but with enough force to punctuate the concession. This armor, it only works with the full kit? Yes, Greer confirmed. But I'll set the repeater plot here where it's secure. Chair, table, feeds, all within Callista's area of sight. Marin will be armored enough to use the overlays, but sheltered enough to heal. And we'll keep the remote systems cold. No locator, no pings. Ethan nodded slowly as the shape of the arrangement settled into something he could accept. Not comfortably. Comfort had no place in the decision. It was a compromise born of necessity, and he distrusted necessary compromises because they often led people to mistake reduced danger for safety. Still, the structure mattered. The chair could be cushioned, the table could be adjusted, the feeds could be positioned so Marin didn't have to turn, stretch, or strain to follow them. Callista could watch her breathing, color, focus, and pain with the same quiet precision she brought to every recovery. Jared would be close enough to read the changes Marin tried to hide from everyone else. And Greer would take her input without surrendering command to her guilt. It wasn't ideal, but ideal had vanished somewhere over Druckenwell. "I'll rig something cushioned here," Ethan said. "She can sit or lie down and see the repeater without strain. That way she can still carry the burden without breaking herself against it." Then it settled. Greer leaned forward and folded his arms over the table, his posture shifting from consideration towards execution. "She and I will coordinate. Callista keeps her stable, and that leaves you and Jared." "Security." Ethan's tone turned rougher, gravel settling into the word because it carried more than pure assignment. "With Talon, Harris, Ral, and Vec watching our backs, Marin will need every drop of focus just to keep up with the feeds. It'll burn her down fast. I've seen it before. You saw it too, on Druckenwell. Jared will be right there with her." Greer's jaw worked once at the mention of Druckenwell, and for a moment the blade on the table seemed to catch the room's low light more sharply than before. "Fallen. Wish I hadn't ordered it, but it was the only option." Ethan met his gray eyes without blinking. He didn't offer any comfort. Comfort would have been the wrong language between them in that moment. Greer had made a battlefield decision under conditions that didn't allow mercy. To be gentle, Ethan knew that. He also knew that the weight of giving an he also knew the weight of giving an order that saved a life by spending part of it. And you'd make the same call again. The Marine didn't argue. His silence answered because honesty required nothing more. Greer had not forgiven himself for the order, and perhaps he never would. But regret didn't change the fact that Marin had survived because someone had been willing to make the necessary call. The knowledge sat between them, heavy and immovable like the stone around them, one more truth folded into the night's planning. At last, Ethan shoved the maps toward him. The gesture was not surrender, it was trust, and like most trust between men who had survived too much, it arrived in practical form rather than open declaration. "Let's see it done." Greer drew the nearest overlay closer and bent over the table, already measuring the repeater station against lines of sight, defensive coverage, and the space Callista would need to reach Marin without obstruction. Ethan reached for a fresh pencil and began marking the chair placement on the blueprint with the same deliberate care that he had used outside among the traps. The war remained quiet around them, broken only by the scrape of the grease pencil over the blueprint, the distant murmur of the estate systems, and the unspoken coordination of two men arranging the night around a wounded woman who would have argued with every protective decision if she had possessed the strength to do so. Neither of them said that aloud. Neither of them needed to. The estate had already begun to bend itself around her recovery, and in the dark before dawn their task was to make certain that it held. Sorry. Shoulders are cranky. Please yell at me if you see me slouching. That is what the commands are there for. It's because I am notorious for slouching, so please tell me to stop if you see me doing that. Shay, I hope you're well and that you're staying cool. It is ridiculous up here. It was like 96 earlier. Oof. Yeah. At the heart of the watch, a Durza estate, Emberlock Room. The Emberlock Room was lit only by glow panels that spilled a soft amber light across stone and wood, leaving the corners shadowed in the gentle way of a place designed to shelter rather than expose. The faint thrum of the estate's generators traveled through the mountain walls as a low, almost bodily reassurance. It was steady enough to become part of the room's silence once your ears accepted it. Marin lay nestled among blankets and woven coverings, the quilt drawn up to her shoulders and the weight of Callista's careful tending arranged around her in every fold. Her left hand clutched her father's tags tightly even in sleep, the chain caught between her fingers and the edge of her palm, her knuckles pale from effort her body should not have been able to sustain. The The sight would have troubled Callista more if she had not known Marin for so long. Marin had always held to what mattered with a stubbornness that outlasted her strength. Pain, fear, and sense alike. Jared had claimed narrow space at her side, not merely as a guardian assigned to watch her, but as the anchor her body and spirit had already chosen. He had shifted carefully to fit against her right side, his arm draped protectively so that his fingers laced with hers while his body remained set between her and the open edge of the bed. Nothing about his posture suggested ease, even though his eyes had closed some time earlier. His breathing remained slow and controlled, not the deep surrender of sleep, but the wary rhythm of someone resting only as far as duty allowed. He had not left her since they'd brought her from the pod. Callista hadn't asked him to. There were some kinds of recovery no healer could impose from outside, and Jared's presence had become part of the room's structure, as surely as the walls, the blankets, the monitoring screen, and the sentinels beyond the door. Callista paused at the threshold, careful not to disturb the fragile quiet before she entered the room fully. She carried the tray balanced against one forearm, 2 bowls of stew steaming faintly beside 1 mug of calf and another of biha. The simple scents entered the room ahead of her, herbs and broth mingling with the faint citrus and earthy warmth of the tea until the emberlock chamber seemed less like a protected medical refuge and more like a room in a home where someone had finally been allowed to rest. She had softened the severity of the chamber as much as protocol permitted. The hard lines remained beneath the blankets, carved wood and warm light, but they no longer dominated the space. Mary needed security, but she also needed reminders that she had not been brought here merely to survive. She had been brought here to return. Callista moved quietly to the bedside table and set the tray among the small things already gathered there. A glass of water, a half-finished carving Jared had begun earlier, and the small screen linked to Marin's vitals. She studied the readings for several moments, pulse steady, breathing regular, healing trance holding without strain. If Marin was going to help them, the time had come to wake her. They had stretched the hours as far as they could without taking from the larger fight waiting beyond the chamber. Callista did not like the decision. That didn't make it wrong. Recovery was rarely the clean surrender to rest that healers wished it could be, and Marin's life had never allowed for easy divisions between healing and duty. Her hand rested lightly on Jared's shoulder, and the touch itself carried most of the message before the brush of the force that followed it. His blue eyes opened immediately, surfacing from shallow rest with a trained awareness of someone who had never truly abandoned the watch. He sat up slowly, careful not to jostle Marin, and his first movement was not toward his weapon or the tray, but towards her face. He brushed a strand of dark hair from her cheek with a tenderness that made no attempt to disguise itself, and then looked to Callista for the part neither of them wanted and both of them understood had become necessary. "Are you ready?" Callista asked, her voice calm but edged with gravity. Jared hesitated, and the grip on Marin's hand tightened before he let his shoulders rise and fall with a long breath. Callista could feel the conflict in him, the fierce desire to shield Marin from every demand, and the equally fierce understanding that shielding her completely would deny her the agency that she would need in the hours ahead. When he nodded, the decision settled through him like a stone finding its place in the bed of a river. It didn't remove the current, but it gave the current something to move around. Callista closed her eyes and reached forward carefully. Her fingertips found Marin's forehead with practiced gentleness, and through that touch she sent a narrow thread of the force into the stillness of the healing trance. She didn't tear Marin free from it. She coaxed. She loosened the weave. She followed the rhythm already present beneath scars, fatigue, and the deep exhaustion of a body that had spent every hour since stricken while fighting to remain alive. For a few long moments, nothing changed except the subtle pressure beneath Callista's fingers. And then Marin's eyelids fluttered, her brow creased, and her left hand curled reflexively around the familiar weight of her father's tags, as if some part of her had returned to consciousness by reaching for the dead who had never stopped guarding her. If I... The word rasped from her throat, raw from disuse and thin with disorientation. Callista pressed a gentle hand to her shoulder. Udesi, you're home on Tanagas. There's food. I want you and Jared to eat, shower, and dress. You've been still for too long. She leaned forward carefully and embraced Marin through the quilt, keeping the contact soft enough not to tax Marin's fragile muscles, yet firm enough to be felt. When she straightened, her smile was faint and tired, but there was warmth in it. I'll give you both a little time. Ooh, sorry. She slipped from the room with the quiet precision of someone who understood that her leaving was also a form of care. Marin needed food, warmth, and supervision, but she also needed to wake to Jared beside her rather than a chamber crowded with concern. The door sealed behind Callista with a soft thunk, and the room seemed to settle around the two who remained. Marin exhaled shakily, her eyes still adjusting to the amber light and the carved lines of the bed frame. Jared squeezed her fingers, waiting until her gaze found his fully. When her blue eyes met his, the disorientation in them didn't vanish, but it changed shape around recognition. We have an ad starting right now. Go get yourself some water.
You're a feisty little one. Fit him with a restraining bolt.
Mesh Limerid gifted a tier 1 sub to the _amazing_McFotcont.
Welcome back from the ad break, my friends. I do hope you actually went to get some water. Please stay hydrated today, and, well, probably into next week. It's been ridiculous up here, and if you're farther south, it's probably worse. So please make sure you're hydrating, getting enough fluids, food, rest if you can. Yeah. Okay. I know. That's my public service announcement for the day. Because I ended up sleeping a lot more than I planned to last night. Long story. But it was needed. She swallowed, the movement faintly painful, and looked as though she meant to push herself upright by force of will alone. Can you help me sit up? Yeah, he murmured, brushing his thumb once against her cheek before he shifted. He rose with careful control and lifted her slowly, one hand supporting her shoulders while the other guided the blankets out of the way. Marin tried to help more than her strength allowed, and he felt the small tremor that ran through her before she could hide it. He said nothing. Instead, he slid pillows behind her back and adjusted them until she could rest against the headboard without having to hold herself upright. The quilt settled across her knees and around her frail body with a familiar weight, and Jared took a moment to make certain her father's tags remained within reach of her hand. Better? He asked softly, leaning close enough to kiss her without making her stretch toward him. Her answering smile was weary, but genuine, and for a moment the room seemed to remember a gentler version of itself. And then her stomach growled loudly enough to break the solemn quiet, and color rose faintly in her cheeks. A half-giggle slipped free before she could stop it, fragile and embarrassed, but unmistakably hers. I guess that settles it. Jared's lips quirked as he reached for the bowl and passed it toward her, but the humor faded when her fingers shook so badly that she could barely hold it. Frustration twisted across Marin's expression with a speed that told him how little distance lay between waking and anger at the limits of her own body. She made a sound halfway between a groan and a curse, and he caught the bowl before the tremor could turn into a spill. "Let me," Jared whispered, taking the spoon and settling beside her with the patience of someone who knew better than to make care feel like surrender. When she made a face at him, he answered it with the gentlest firmness he could manage. "You're not a child, Marin, but you are weak, and I promised you'd have your strength again." The words settled her before pride could harden into refusal. Jared kissed her temple between spoonfuls and fed her slowly, giving her time to swallow, breathe, and recover between each small bite. Marin endured the help at first more than she accepted it, her blue eyes tracking the spoon with the offended dignity of someone who had faced armies and resented being defeated by stew. Gradually, the heat and nourishment did what argument could not. Some color returned to her cheeks, the tension around her mouth eased, and the hand clutching the tags loosened enough for the chain to shift against the quilt. By the time the bowl was set aside, she looked less like someone pulled unwillingly from the edge of sleep, and more like herself, diminished but present, fragile but aware. She studied Jared then, her blue eyes narrowing slightly as she felt the tension he had been trying to keep from her through their bond. Exhaustion had not dulled that part of her. If anything, recovery had stripped away the distractions that might otherwise have softened her perception. "Jared, Kaysel, Mibana, what's going on?" His hands found hers again, and for a moment he only held them as he took a slow breath. He had imagined telling Marin in a dozen different ways over the years, and none of those imagined moments had included an Emberlock room, a mountain fortress, Deathwatch shadows pressing toward the estate, and Marin still weak enough that a bowl of stew had become a trial. Yet the truth had waited too long already. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers in the gentlest of Covin, anchoring the confession in contact because words alone felt too brittle for what they needed to carry. "I should have told you long ago. Kothra, I was, the son of one of Duran's lieutenants, Algren." The use of his familiar name for her caught her attention as surely as any order might have. The silence that followed was heavy enough to alter the room. Marin's breath caught, and shock rippled through the force in a sharp pulse that reached him before her expression fully changed. Her hand stilled. She didn't pull away. That, more than anything, nearly undid him. He had feared anger. He had feared rejection. He had feared that the truth, once spoken, would place him on the wrong side of a history already soaked in enough blood. Instead, Marin remained where she was, pale beneath the amber light, her eyes fixed on him with pain, surprise, and the fierce effort to understand. "You knew," she whispered at last, "and still chose this?" "Yes." His grip tightened around her hands, steadying himself as much as her. "When I discovered what he was, and later who you were, I swore that I would do whatever I could to protect you, even if it meant staying apart sometimes. That's why I wasn't there on Coruscant or part of the rescue on Bastine. Not because I didn't want to be, because I couldn't risk making it worse." His eyes closed briefly as memory cut through him with the old sharpness of absence chosen for her safety rather than his comfort. "I wanted nothing more than to be there." Marin folded into him with more trust than strength, her arms slipping around his shoulders as though the movement had been waiting beneath the shock all along. Jared breathed in and held her carefully. One hand braced against her back and the other cradling her close without pressing too hard. Her voice was muffled against his chest, thin but steadying as the meaning settled through her. I've doubted myself so many times these last few years, wondered if I chose wrong, but hearing this now... She tilted her head to meet his eyes, and the gratitude there was raw enough to hurt. Florentier, I needed to hear it. Oh, sorry. This is actually kind of emotional, so bear with me. He kissed her gently, not to interrupt the words, but to meet them with everything he had not known how to say for too long. When he drew back, he kept his forehead near hers, his voice lowering into the fragile quiet between them. Marin, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. The confession moved through their bond like sunlight reaching scarred stone, bright enough to reveal the damage without diminishing its warmth. Marin's breath caught, and tears gathered in her eyes before she kissed him fiercely despite the weakness in her body. Her hands tightened around his shoulder, and when she whispered against his ear, the words carried more than affection. They carried choice, recognition, and the stubborn promise of a woman who had returned from darkness and still knew what she wanted to hold. Nicartelir, Gar, I cherish you. The glow panels hummed softly above them, and beyond the sealed door, Vex shifted his stance with the quiet patience of a sentinel who knew the difference between intrusion and protection. Inside, Jared and Marin leaned into one another as the room held them in amber light. The heart of the watch bound not by command or protocol, but by love, spoken truthfully at last. The door sealed behind Callista with a soft thunk, and the hush of the ember-locked chamber gave way to the cooler stillness of the corridor beyond. She paused just outside, drawing a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Within the room, Marin's presence flickered against her senses like an ember coaxed back to life after long smothering. The light was not strong yet, and it had not steadied fully, but it was alive and awake. For the moment, that was enough. Callista allowed herself only that much relief before discipline gathered around it, because Marin's waking had not ended the watch. It had merely changed the shape of what the watch required. Her senses rippled gently outward through the force, following the threads that wove between the sealed room and the living presences nearby. Jared remained inside, anchored close to Marin with a presence taut but unwavering, a quiet cord drawn tight across years of promises he had never spoken aloud until now. Marin's pulse, faint but steadier, whispered against the current like a heartbeat Callista had known in different forms since first meeting the girl in Catan. She had been barely 12 then, fierce-eyed and unyielding, walking into the trials Anne had set with her shoulders already weighted by burdens no child should have been asked to carry. Callista remembered the wet loam and pine in the Praxium forests. She remembered the way Marin's hands had shaken as she held the knife steady against the wolfhound, refusing to let fear unmake her. She had been wounded even then, still recovering from Ethan's trial and from the cruelty of her peers, yet she had not faltered. 5 kills brought home not 4. The same fire that had carried her through that day still burned now, banked low beneath exhaustion but not extinguished. The echo of that memory bled gently into Callista's present awareness. Beside the door, Vex stood at his post, his matte armor dark in the corridor light, his stillness shaped by discipline and something older than mere instruction. He was the lion at the threshold, silent and immovable, his presence folded into the balance of the corridor itself. Callista studied him with both her eyes and her senses, noting the outward calm, the inward readiness, and the patience running beneath every line of his stance. Nothing about his posture strained toward unnecessary action. He didn't hover, he didn't crowd the door, he simply held it, and in that holding he became part of Marin's recovery as surely as any medicine or blanket within the chamber. To Callista's senses, he was not merely a guard at the door. He was part of the weave itself, with Jared within and Vec without, each anchoring Marin in his own way. It formed a perimeter more personal than steel, shields, or locks. The structure reminded her of something she had once whispered to Zan long ago, when she had still thought of herself as merely a healer and not a warrior. Sometimes strength was not in the blade, but in the quiet presence that kept another safe long enough to draw breath again. Tonight that truth stood in the corridor in marine armor and sat inside the chamber beside a wounded young woman who had finally opened her eyes. Her hand brushed unconsciously over the small satchel slung at her side. Inside lay the shawl she had embroidered, the Laheyatoran pattern woven into the threads with care. She had not left it in the room yet. Some gifts required timing, and some symbols needed to be offered only when the person receiving them had enough strength to hold their meaning. Mara needed to find her center first. She needed food, warmth, Jared's truth, and the grounding reality of her own breath before Callista placed another layer of memory and belonging across her shoulders. Soon, when Marin was steadier and her eyes could lift without flinching from everything that still waited beyond the room, Callista would bring the shawl in, and Marin would understand. She would know that she was not alone in what she carried. She had never been alone, no matter how many years had tried to convince her otherwise. For now, Callista stepped back and centered herself in the corridor. The touch of her senses widened again, brushing over the hum of power within the walls, the distant murmur of preparations in the war room below, and the grounded weight of Ethan's presence beside Greer as they turned their attention toward the defenses forming around the estate. The bulwark gathering around Marin was not built only from durasteel stone and coated systems. It was made of lives, choices, vows, and old loyalties that had found their way into the same mountain chamber at the same hour. Callista turned her head slightly, catching Vec's profile in the corridor glow. "Steady?" she asked softly. He didn't shift or look away from the corridor he guarded, but his voice remained calm. "Steady, ma'am." Stone and silence. Durza Estate war room. The durasteel door clicked as the tumblers released, weight shifting through its frame with the sound of durasteel engineering and years of use, by people who had understood that some rooms existed to be entered only with purpose. Callista pressed her palm flat against the panel and felt the cool grinding of metal through her skin as the lock yielded. The sensation anchored her for a moment before she stepped inside, leaving the guarded corridor and the ember-warm quiet of the emberlock chamber behind her. The door sealed again with a quiet finality, the code lock sinking back into place, and the sound did not feel like exclusion. It felt like another layer of the estate closing where it needed to close. Not to trap those within, but to protect what the mountain had been asked to hold. The war room's amber light came not from stark overhead panels, but from narrow glow panels recessed into the stone walls, their muted glow washing across the ironwood beams above and leaving the corners in soft shadow. The air smelled faintly of old leather, steel polish, warm circuitry, and the mineral coolness of stone buried deep enough that the weather outside seemed more a memory than a presence. Jarius hadn't built this room for comfort, though he had not made it careless either. Its austerity held purpose. Every surface seemed chosen for durability. Every line of sight served the table at its center. It was a room for decisions, and as Callista crossed the stone floor, her robes brushing softly beneath the hum of the holoprojectors, she felt the old weight of that truth settle around her. Some rooms carried their history through ornament. This one carried it through readiness. Ethan stood on the far side of the table with his shoulders squared beneath the burden of maps, patrol timings, trap placements, and silent calculations. The holographic display painted pale blue light across the planes of his armor and the lines of concentration etched into his face. Sentry markers pulsed across the estate grounds in slow, measured intervals, each one a living person holding a portion of the night at bay. Greer leaned on the opposite edge of the table with his arms folded across his chest, his gray eyes flicking over the display as though daring it to conceal something from him. Neither man looked surprised by her arrival. Both had been expecting her, though neither had called for her. That was how the house had functioned since Merrin had been brought within its walls. No one crowded the Umberlock room. No one intruded upon Callista's authority, and yet every decision in the war room left a place for whatever she would bring from it. Callista did not speak immediately. She let the room breathe around her and allowed the silence to acknowledge her presence before she added words to it. There were times when urgency demanded immediate reports, and times when haste only made fear louder. This was the latter. Ethan watched her without pressing, and Greer's attention, sharp as ever, shifted from the display to her face long enough to read what he could before she offered it aloud. The trust and that restraint mattered. Neither man asked whether Merrin still lived. Neither demanded numbers before she had crossed the room. They waited, because Callista had the watch over Merrin's body, and both of them understood that her judgment carried the authority of more than a scanner. "She's awake," she said at last. I'm gonna pause there so I don't get in the middle of a sentence in the ad break. I hope you guys are enjoying the story so far. As always, if you have questions, let me know here in chat. Please go get yourself some water or have a stretch. I will see you back here in a minute and a half. Gee, thanks, Frosty Tools. Cozy corners? I mean, this place is full of cozy corners. That's not really a surprise. Come on. Both men lifted their eyes fully to her. Ethan's gaze remained steady and direct, his brown eyes carrying relief so tightly contained that it revealed itself only in the slight easing of tension around his mouth, and the depth of the breath he had not quite let become a sigh. Greer's gray eyes narrowed in the reflexive way of a man trained to question every report until the threat inside it had been identified, but the suspicion faded almost as quickly as he read the steadiness beneath her tone. Callista let them have that first truth before she gave them the rest, because even warriors needed a heartbeat to receive good news when the knights had taught them not to trust it easily. "She's speaking with Jared," Callista added. "Eating. Not much, but enough to steady her. She'll hold when you call for her." Ethan's jaw shifted. Not in doubt, but in the slow, calculating motion of a man who had learned across too many campaigns that medical reports were never made of numbers alone. Callista's phrasing told him more than a readout would have. Merrin was awake, but not recovered, nourished, but not strong, ready to answer, but only within the limits the rest of them would have to enforce when she tried to cross them. He gave a single nod, accepting the report and its unspoken cautions, together. Good. That's one less fire to choke down. He turned back toward the table and braced both hands against its edge, his weight shifting into the practical work that had always steadied him when concern had nowhere useful to go. The estate holds. Patrols are set, but I want nothing moving without a second set of eyes. Every post stays doubled, no exceptions. If they come, it won't be where we expect. Or when. Greer? Already done. Greer's voice came low and gravel rough. Ooh, sorry. Yet firm enough to carry certainty without wasting volume. Vex got the main corridor. Harris is circling the north wall. I'll push Ral to the ridge path at midnight. Talan has the south corridor. There's no blind ground left. He leaned forward slightly, and the blue glow of the tactical map sharpened the angles of his face. They try. They bleed. Ethan's nod was curt. The approval contained because both men understood the work was not finished simply because the assignments had been made. Vec at the main corridor mattered, not only because the corridor was a key route, but because thresholds had become the shape of his watch since Marion was carried home. Harris on the north wall gave them experienced eyes along the colder approach, where stone, shadow, and tree cover could conceal movement longer than sensors like to admit. Prowl on the ridge path at midnight would close one of the estate's less obvious vulnerabilities during the hour when tired sentries most often trusted habit too much. Talon in the south corridor placed another steady point where the interior defenses needed discipline more than numbers. The structure was sound. Callista could feel it even before Ethan looked back to her, not because walls and posts spoke through the force as people did, but because the living pattern of those guarding them had begun to settle into a deliberate order. "And you?" Ethan asked, quiet but heavy. "What do you feel?" Callista's throat tightened. He never asked that lightly. Not here, not now, and not when the estate was preparing itself around a wounded woman and a threat that might never strike or might already be moving toward them under cover of darkness. Ethan remembered Bastion. He remembered how she had felt Zan's death burn through her mid-transit to Bastille, as if distance had meant nothing to the loss, and the void between worlds had been no barrier at all. He remembered the cost of asking her to open herself to impressions when fear already pressed too close. So did she. When Ethan asked for what she felt, it was not superstition, indulgence, or even desperation. It was trust, given with the same seriousness he gave to armor, blades, terrain, and shields. She closed her eyes and allowed her breath to settle. The hum of the holoprojector faded into the background, then the muted thrum of power in the walls, then the faint pressure of Ethan and Greer watching her. She lowered her thoughts into the quiet currents that moved through stone and silence. The estate carried history within its walls, not as memory in the way living beings remembered, but as impressions of weight and shape. Greer lay set into the mortar. Strength had been pressed into the beams by hands that had survived, rebuilt, and prepared for dangers that had not yet chosen their names. Around that older presence moved the threads of the present. Sentries steady at their posts, the disciplined alertness of Marines whose names might never be spoken if failed protocol demanded silence, and the watchful patience of Vec at the main corridor and the quiet pulse of duty stretching from room to room. Jaren's presence burned steady and bright behind the Emberlock protocols, drawn tight near Marin with the focus of someone who had made himself both companion and guardian. Marin's spark remained fragile, still dimmed by injury and the demands of waking before healing had finished its work. But it was unbroken, as steady as a coal protected against the dark by careful hands. Ethan stood before her like a rooted tree, his concern buried deep within layers of discipline, but no less real for being held there. Greer's presence was sharper, restless and outward turned, a weapon that had learned to think like a wall when those behind him required shelter. The balance was taut. It would not survive carelessness. It might not survive a hard enough blow, yet in that moment, held within stone, watch, and trust, it held. Sorry. When Callista opened her eyes again, both men were watching. Neither interrupted the silence before she chose to break it, and that restraint steadied her more than either of them likely realized. "The strands are tight," she said softly, "drawn thin, but in balance. Jared burns steadily, Marin holds, though every thread around her strains to guard her. The estate itself." She let her hand brush the stone edge of the table, grounding her impressions in something cool and solid beneath her palm. It remembers its own scars. And it stands. For now, it stands. Silence followed. Greer's jaw worked once, his expression unreadable in the amber and blue light, and he gave a short nod. It was not the nod of a man who understood the Force as she did. It was the nod of a soldier accepting a report from someone whose instincts had earned his respect. Ethan studied her longer, his eyes searching not for weakness, not for hesitation, but for the truth he already knew that she would give him, no matter how much it cost her. At last, he straightened. When he spoke, his voice remained low, but the firmness beneath it filled the chamber more completely than volume could have. "That's enough for me. We hold the line. We don't shift until the dark forces us to, and if it does, it'll find us waiting. Stone and silence. Nothing else." His words settled into the war room with the weight of something that would not be moved. Callista lowered her gaze briefly, not in submission, but in recognition. He trusted her. Enough to carry her into the fire at Bastille. Enough to listen now when silence itself felt like a knife edge drawn along the mountain's spine. That trust had always been a weight, but it was not one she resented. It was a weight she chose to bear. Just as Ethan chose the walls, Greer chose the watch, Jared chose the bedside, and Marin, fragile and awake behind Emberlock, would choose whatever duty her body could survive. Around them, the estate held its breath beneath stone and shadow, and within the war room, the lines in the dark settled into place. Oh, I am totally slouching. At least I caught myself. Corridor between shadows. The corridor was narrow and cool, its walls lined in muted stone whose textured surface caught the faint amber glow of recessed glow panels and reflected it in a subdued wash along the passage. Callista moved along it in silence, the hem of her katani robes trailing in soft whispers across the polished floor, though the quiet around her was not empty. The estate breathed through its hidden systems, through the low hum of generators buried behind walls, through the faint shift of air moving through ducts concealed within old stone. Her senses remained tethered to the Emberlock chamber she had left behind, to Marin's faint but steady signature in the Force, and to Jared's watchful presence wound tight beside her, to Vex standing unmoving at his post like a pillar carved into the hall itself. The balance she had spoken of in the war room held for now, stretched thin across grief, exhaustion, and duty, yet still intact beneath the mountain's weight. Shadows remained at the edge of it. Callista felt them brushed against her perception, not as immediate danger, but as a pressure along the borders of her awareness, the way the Force could dim and strain where pain, memory, and fatigue gathered too densely. No hostile presence prowled the stairwells. No coded lock had failed. No alarm had pierced the estate's layered quiet. What pressed against her senses now was older and more patient than a breach. It was the long shadow of exhaustion, the gravity of grief that had not been given space to settle before another crisis demanded motion, and the ache of recognizing in Marin the shape of a wound Callista herself had carried after Zan fell. It moved through her like tidewater, steady and insistent, pulling memory into the present until the corridor seemed to hold more than stone, soft illumination, and silence. When she rounded the bend at the end of the corridor, she found Ethan waiting. He did not stand there as commander in a briefing room or armored sentinel at the estate gates, though both roles remained close beneath the surface. He stood in the corridor with his arms folded, his shoulders squared, and his brown eyes searching. His presence quieter than command and more personal than strategy. His deep brown eyes caught hers as if he'd been tracking her steps since she left the war room. Not through any device or report, but through the familiar instinct of a husband who knew how she carried herself when she had taken too much into her keeping. "Cal," he said quietly, his voice low enough that it didn't travel beyond the bend of the corridor. Callista slowed, her hand brushing the wall as if the cool stone might steady the sudden tightening in her chest. His tone alone told her what the word meant. He was not calling her as a Mandalorian. He was not calling her as a Jedi or a healer or even the woman responsible for deciding how much Marin's weakened body could endure. He was calling her as his wife, and that stripped away the layer she had wrapped around herself since Catane more efficiently than any demand could have. The force pressed close around her again, sharpening scent, sound, and sensation until small details gathered weight. She smelled the cool tang of the durasteel hinges from the war room door farther behind her. She heard the faint hum of concealed generators threading through the estate walls. She heard Ethan's breathing, measured and steady, yet burdened by more than calculation. The corridor's shadow stretched long beneath the amber glow panels, not threatening, but watchful, as though the moment itself had drawn breath and held it. Ethan stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she could see the faint strain at the corners of his eyes. It was not the tension of command, or not only that. This was older, rooted in the losses they had survived together and the ones neither of them had entirely laid down. His hand lifted, hesitating for the briefest moment, and then cupped her cheek with callous gentleness. The warmth of his palm steadied her in a way words rarely could, and Callista allowed herself to lean into it without apology. There were not many places left in the night where she could be held without needing to explain what she carried. Ethan had always been one of them. "You said Jared and Marin are strong enough to stand," Ethan murmured, his voice quiet steel. "I trust your read. But when you said she carries more than wounds, I need you to tell me plainly. No veiled words, Cal. Just you." Sorry. Memory stirred through her before she could answer. She remembered the deck plates of the Werda thrumming beneath her feet when Zan's presence vanished from the galaxy like a flame drowned in water. She remembered the impossible absence that followed, the way distance had meant nothing because loss had found her anyway, burning through the force and leaving her with silence where a living presence had once been. She remembered Ethan's hand steadying her, wordless and unshaken, while she folded against the bulkhead with grief too heavy for speech. She had thought herself broken in that instant. He had not let her fall, and perhaps that was why he asked now with such care. He was not demanding pain from her for the sake of strategy. He was asking because he knew the wound well enough to recognize its echo in another. Her breath caught, and she turned her face slightly into his touch. "She carries weight the way I did, Ethan. When Zan fell, it changes how you breathe, how you look at the stars. It makes every step forward feel heavier than the last, but she's still reaching, still steadying herself. That is what tells me she'll endure." Ethan's thumb brushed her cheek, the gesture tender but not fragile, firm in the way of anchors, of earth beneath boots, and of something that remained steady when the rest of the world shifted. His gaze did not leave hers. The corridor around them held the quiet of stone and hidden defenses, but the promise forming between them belonged to something older than the estate and more intimate than any operational plan. Ethan had lost enough to know that endurance was not guaranteed simply because others needed it. He also knew that those who endured rarely did so alone. Then we'll see her through it, he said. Not as a commander and a Jedi, as elite family. That's the vow I need from you, Cal. Not for order's sake. For hers. The corridor seemed to grow warmer with his words, the glow panels casting amber across the line of his jaw and the steadiness of his stance. Callista could feel his conviction as sharply as the edge of a blade, not forged in the force but in the hard-earned discipline of a life spent surviving loss and choosing, again and again, to stand between danger and those he claimed as his own. He was not asking whether Marin deserved that devotion. Neither of them would have dignified such a question. He was naming what had already become true around her. That the protection gathering in the estate was not merely defensive architecture or military coordination, but family closing ranks around one of its own who was wounded. Callista closed her fingers over his wrist, grounding herself in the warmth of his skin. Her reply was soft but unwavering. For hers. Always. Shay, you're terrible. I'm trying to be serious. Oh. Oh boy. I needed that though. We have an ad starting, by the way. If we're not already there. Yep, we're there. Hey look, I didn't miss the end of the ad break again. I have actually been considering turning on the setting in Sarabot where it will warn of incoming ads for you guys. I mean, I see it, but you guys don't, so I see the timer. So I've been considering turning that on, but I already have enough going on in the chat from other things, so I don't want to flood it too much. So that's why I haven't enabled it. I'm drinking my tea even though it's cold. An appropriately Star Warsy mug. See? But you guys already knew I was a nerd, so that shouldn't be any surprise. Oh, Shay, you weren't here. We now have an actual physical mascot. Look! See, okay, see this little cat over in the corner of my screen? We have a physical mascot. Isn't it adorable? It's super soft, too. Yeah. So, this little guy has been hanging out with me for the last couple of days. I know, right? I don't have to feed it or clean up after it, but it's still, like, massively soft. Yeah. It'll just eat my affection, like, for breakfast. But I don't have to feed it, I don't have to clean up after it. I'm good with that. I know. But see, you still need to be fed and watered and stuff. It's important. Oh man. Okay. We are about halfway done with the chapter, maybe a little bit more. We'll see how that goes. Okay. Oh my goodness. Okay, there we go. My stream chat was being weird for a second. Okay. And because I can't see, this is happening. If you wear glasses, you will understand. I swear I don't touch them. I literally don't. And they still end up with smudges. No slouch. I know. I'm totally slouching. You know, there's a command for that. There's a posture check command. It's a thing. But yes, feel free to yell at me about slouching. I do that a lot. Okay. Oh, there is. There totally is. If you go look down at the commands list, it's there. I believe it's exclamation point posture check. I think. I can actually double check that for you. Oh, hold on. Oh, no, wait. One sec. I lied. Oh, no, it's under the channel point redeems. I think. What the? Oh yeah. So it's under the channel point redeems. I lied. So if you go down to the bottom of the chat where it has the little you have the thing for bits, and then right next to that you have a little thing that looks like a little mini data card. If you click that, if you have enough points, I think it's 100 points, and it's like on my screen it's like you've got the power-ups, and then it's when you go down to the actual redeems, it's like 4th row down in the middle. Yeah. So yeah, there you go. There you go. Yep. I can never remember what the order is on those things. It used to be in my stream elements spot, but I put it under channel point redeems a little while ago, just for something to be a little bit more interactive. I really do like when people use those because it makes me pay attention to chat. Oh, you're getting a free stretch out of that. Oh man. That's probably part of what happens when I spend 9.5 hours sleeping. Apparently I needed that. Long story. I slept about 7.5 hours last night. And then was awake for like an hour. and then promptly face planted again for like another 2 hours. That's usually my problem, is what the hell is sleep. That is literally usually my problem. But I actually slept for more than like 6 hours, which was pretty impressive. So I will take it. But I'd also had a really crazy week, so that might have just been also my body being like, no, we're not done yet. Go back to bed, woman. So that's probably part of what that was. Also, yesterday was kind of stupid. I had a bunch of appointments, so we didn't get home until probably 6. Yeah, I had like 4 appointments yesterday. Note to self, don't ever do that many in a day. It's exhausting. I would recommend no more than 3. But I also was looking at it from the perspective of, I don't want to have to come back into town. And it was also ridiculously hot yesterday. So I was trying to get them all done. So I had, my first one was like 8:30 in the morning, and then my last one was at 4. Ugh. But I'm just glad they're done. They all went well, so nothing ridiculous. Bunch of it was just like follow-up stuff. So nothing super concerning. Everything's pretty good. So yeah. It just happened that I happened to get all 4 of them in one day, which has never happened before. That's an accomplishment, but I'm never doing that many in a day ever again. Most I'll ever do is 3. But it was good because it was a day off, so I didn't have to go to work. And amongst all of that, I probably couldn't have anyway because of how spread out they were. So that is my reminder for you guys to please take care of yourselves. Go see the doctor when you need to. Go eat food, get rest, drink water. Yeah. So please take care of yourselves. I would appreciate if you did, and you probably will too. Alright. I know, right? Ugh. That's probably why I slept for 9.5 hours. Because I don't usually do that much running around in a day. And on top of that, it was like 90 degrees yesterday. So it was just ridiculous. So we were inside as much as we possibly could be, because otherwise we would have just heat exhaustion, which I don't recommend either. It's not fun. Again, drink your water. Especially when it's that hot. Here we go. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The world narrowed to breath, pulse, and the vow sealed between them in the amber-lit corridor. Ethan's hand remained against her cheek, warm and steady, a tether against the weight that had pressed into her since Druckenwell. She had not asked for that anchoring, because she rarely asked for what she needed when others required her strength first. But he had offered it freely, and that made it unshakable. The shadows that had leaned close at the edges of her perception didn't vanish. They remained where grief and exhaustion had placed them, but they no longer felt as though they were closing around her alone. Yeah, basically. Oh, it's been ridiculous up here too. You should. I'll send you the what the forecast thing I had for earlier today later. Ridiculousness. At last, Ethan exhaled slowly, as though releasing something he'd been holding too tightly. His hand slipped from her cheek along the line of her jaw before following back to his side. The change in his posture was subtle but unmistakable. The quiet shift from husband into commander, of the man she loved into the warrior their estate still needed. His shoulders squared, his feet settled on the corridor center line, and his presence filled the space like a shield settling into place. Callista watched the transformation with the recognition only she could have. He was the same man, No less tender for becoming harder to the world beyond them, but responsibility drew its lines over him like armor. He gave a short nod, his eyes never leaving hers. Then it's sealed. The words carried no ceremony. They didn't need to. Callista felt them settle into the corridor like a weight added to a foundation stone, immovable and binding. She inclined her head in return, one hand brushing her sleeve where the Razatai cord lay knotted around her wrist. Her vow to Zan, her vow now to Marin, and her vow to Ethan. Threads of memory and the present woven together in the silence until they no longer felt like separate strands. And when she let her hand fall back to her side, the motion felt less like release than readiness. Her gaze shifted down the corridor toward the Emberlock wing. Marin's presence remained faint through the force, distant but steadier than before, a pulse of fragile resilience that drew Callista forward as surely as any call spoken aloud. Jared remained with her, a bright and watchful anchor at the bedside. Vec remained without, holding the threshold in disciplined silence. Ethan stood before Callista in the junction between war room and chamber, between strategy and healing, and between the estate's outer defenses and its wounded heart. The shadows that had pressed inward earlier felt less sharp now, thinned by the vow Ethan had asked for and the one that she had given. She turned toward the Emberlock wing, her robes whispering against the stone once more. Ethan stepped aside, neither barring her path nor trying to follow where her work required her to go alone. Even so, his stance told her he would remain near the junction as long as the estate required it. Sentinel at the core, shield between rooms and husband and warrior both. As she passed, the faint brush of his presence followed her, not as a tether to hold her back, but as a promise that even when duty moved them apart, they didn't stand alone. Oh, welcome in to Sniper. Good to see you. I know, I don't usually stream on a Friday. Throwing everybody off. uh... Okay. Threads woven in quiet resolve. Desert estate, Emberlock room, and perimeter. The glow panels gave the Emberlock chamber a hushed warmth, their amber light softened by stone, old wood, and the careful arrangement of things Callista had insisted belonged in a room meant for recovery rather than containment alone. The pod was gone from the center of the chamber, its severity replaced by the carved bed, the folded blankets, and the faint scent of broth and behot, and the quieter evidence of people trying to make shelter out of a room built for secrecy. Marin sat on the edge of the bed, no longer held within the healing trance or sealed beneath Emberlock shrouding, but the absence of those protections did not make her strong. The quilt Callista had laid across her shoulders gathered heavily around her narrow frame, and beneath it she seemed smaller than she would have allowed herself to appear if pride had possessed enough strength to stand between her and the truth of her condition. Her father's tags gleamed faintly against her chest, warmed by the room's light and the heat of her skin, while her fingers worried the metal with restless, uneven pressure as though touch alone might hold back the tide of memory, grief, and doubt that had risen too often in the quiet spaces between battles. Jared remained at her side, steady in the way he had become for her over years of absence, return, and difficult truths. His posture appeared loose at first glance, but his attention never truly left her. He measured the tremors in her breath, the way her hand shook when she tried to do too much, the faint lines of pain etched near her temples whenever she shifted without thinking. He had learned long ago that Marin hid pain by moving through it quickly, by turning frustration into motion before anyone could stop her, and the weaknesses left by Druckenwell had taken that defense from her. Now everything showed if one knew where to look. The effort it took to sit upright, the fatigue gathered beneath her eyes, the way she leaned into him and then tried a heartbeat later to pretend she hadn't needed the support quite so much. Jared didn't name any of it aloud. He simply stayed close enough that she could borrow his strength without asking for it. Her voice was muffled against his chest, softened by the quilt and the steady rhythm of his breathing beneath her ear. There have been many times over the last few years and the last few months, especially, when I'd started to question myself, and at times this path I've chosen to walk. I knew from the very beginning that it would never be simple. I know some of that is my own self-doubt, and some of that is all the things that I've been through. Jared lowered his gaze to her, the confession settling into the space between them with the heavy familiarity of something he had sensed before she found words for it. He had seen those doubts in the spaces between missions, and the way she looked too long at reports that carried names she knew. In the guarded silences after Bastine and the harder silences now after Druckenwell. He lifted her chin gently, giving her every chance to pull away and feeling the small, weary trust in the fact that she did not. His blue eyes locked on hers before he kissed her, tenderly, across lips still rough from healing sleep and dehydration. The kiss held no demand. It was steadiness offered in the only language that could reach beneath the arguments she might have raised if she had possessed the strength. "We all have our moments of doubt, Marin," he said softly when he drew back. "Even I have, and I still do, at times. It's only natural. It's part of why I've tried to be here for you as much as possible and offer you support." We have an ad starting, my friends. See you in a minute and a half. I hit the wrong button. But anyway. You've been through so much. He leaned his forward to hers in a gentle coven, letting the contact carry what explanation alone could not. It was not only affection, it was a promise, presence, and the quiet insistence that she did not have to hold the weight of her choices alone, simply because she had learned how to survive carrying too much. Marin's breath trembled against him, and he felt the effort she made to steady it before the tremor could become something larger. She had been forced to endure so many things by mastering herself. Tonight, he hoped she might allow herself something other than mastery. "That was why we chose the joint assignment to intelligence, remember?" he murmured. "So we could be together?" Marin's lips curved faintly, a fragile smile in the dim light. It did not erase the exhaustion from her face or the pain gathered beneath her skin, but it changed the room around them all the same. For a moment, the Emberlock chamber held not only injury and secrecy, but memory. Long corridors, shared briefings, half-finished arguments, silent watches, and the stubborn hope that they had built in the margins of dangerous work. The assignment had never been simple, and neither of them had been naive enough to believe proximity would solve everything. Still, it mattered. They had chosen it because distance had already cost them too much. Jared brushed a strand of hair from her temple, his fingers lingering there with careful warmth. I had tried to tell you all of this before, but it didn't feel like the right time. His hand tightened around hers. Not enough to hurt, only enough to tell her he was still there when the next words came. He hesitated, because the truth deserved to be spoken cleanly, not rushed to fill the silence. Marin, I know we've spoken of this a few times and more recently. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. The words trembled slightly, but the kiss that followed steadied them both. Marin's eyes fluttered closed, and the force gathered around her with the strange, tender quality of unseen hands cupping an ember against the wind. She had heard vows before, sworn by comrades, family, Marines, Jedi, and even Mandalorians in language shaped by grief and duty. This one reached differently. It moved through the places inside her that had wondered whether the path she had chosen had cost too much. Whether love could survive secrecy, whether being hunted for reasons she had not fully understood meant she had become too dangerous to keep close. Jared's love filtered through the bond like sunlight finding stone that had gone cold in shadow. Her breath caught, then steadied as she drew him into a rough but gentle kiss, giving back as much certainty as her weakened body could offer. I love you, Marin. He breathed into the space between them. The words remained between them as something living, not fragile because they were quiet, but made stronger by the room that held them. Jared's ice-blue eyes flicked briefly toward the corridor beyond the sealed door, where Vex stood sentry without needing to announce his presence. Even beyond the barrier, Jared knew the shape of that watch. Armor still, attention outward, his gaze sweeping each shadow and every subtle change in the hallway. Vex's presence at the threshold had become part of the chamber's rhythm, a wordless guardrail around the intimacy inside. Jared understood the gift of that silence. He lowered his voice further, not because Vex would intrude, but because the room itself seemed to call for gentleness. We should get cleaned up. Do you need help getting to the refresher? Marin's sigh answered for her before pride could organize a better reply. It carried exhaustion, irritation, and reluctant acceptance in equal measure, and Jared's soft chuckle warmed the edge of it without mocking her. He eased her upright slowly, keeping one arm around her until he was certain her feet had found the floor beneath the quilt's hem. The first steps cost her more than she wanted him to see. Her balance wavered once, and her fingers tightened around his forearm with enough force to betray the fear beneath the frustration. He didn't comment. He simply adjusted his pace to hers and steadied her without making the assistance feel like restraint, guiding her across the short distance to the refresher as though the journey required patience rather than pity. When she reached the doorway, he waited until she had one hand braced securely against the frame before easing away. Call if you need me. I know, Marin murmured, and though the words were quiet, the faint dryness in them was familiar enough to make his chest ache with relief. He returned to the bed only after the refresher door closed and habit carried him into motion before thought fully caught up. He smoothed the blanket, straightened the quilt, and set Callista's satchel aside where it would not be knocked to the floor, and gathered the small signs of the long watch into order. The work steadied him, tidying a bed, clearing a tray, and checking the placement of water and medicine. Folding a blanket were ordinary tasks, and ordinary tasks had their own power after days ruled by sealed pods, coded reports, and the awful uncertainty of whether Marin would ever wake at all. From the satchel he drew clean clothes Callista had prepared, the warm coverall and undershirt Marin favored most, soft from repeated washing and carrying a faint trace of the forest air in the estate's cedar-lined storage. He lingered over the fabric for a moment, pressing it briefly to his cheek before laying it neatly at the foot of the bed, because he knew she would need something familiar against her skin when armor and duty began pressing close again. Sorry. Beyond the chamber, the house remained alive in disciplined silence. Harris and Raoul moved in quiet arcs along the estate's perimeter, their patrols floating through stone corridors, outer passages, and reinforced access points with the ease of Marines who understood how to sustain vigilance. Veil-cleared squads answered haptic signals, passing updates through the estate without disturbing the room where the recovery held its fragile ground. Along the walls, faint haptic pulses occasionally traveled through the concealed systems, unnoticed by most and recognized by those trained to feel the rhythm of the watch. Perimeter green, south approach clear, corridor secure. The estate didn't sleep around Marin, it listened, adjusted, guarded, and held. Yvette remained still as stone outside the Emberlock room, his presence another kind of tether in the architecture of protection surrounding her. He didn't stand like a man waiting for something to happen. He stood like a threshold that had already decided what would and would not be allowed to pass. The glow from the corridor glow panels touched the edges of his armor and left the rest of him in muted shadow, and every so often his attention moved with almost invisible precision from one end of the hall to the other. He knew what unfolded beyond the door was not his to witness. That was part of the duty. He guarded the silence as carefully as he guarded the entrance, holding the line between the world pressing inward and the wounded, quiet Marin needed in order to return to herself. Inside the chamber, Jared laid the clothes in order and glanced once toward the refresher, listening not to intrude, but to make certain Marin had not fallen or gone too still. He heard the water begin to run, unevenly at first, and then steady, and some part of him released a breath he'd not realized he was holding. The sound was small, domestic, and almost unbearably hopeful. It meant Marin was awake enough to wash, stubborn enough to insist on privacy, and alive enough to resent how much help she still needed. Jared rested one hand against the carved bedpost Jairus had shaped years before and allowed himself the briefest moment of stillness. Around him, the chamber held its amber quiet. Beyond the door, Velk held the threshold, and beyond the chamber, the estate held its watch. Within the fragile center of that protection, Marin was still finding her way back. One breath, one step, and one familiar piece of clothing at a time. And we're probably gonna go to like 9:30 at this rate. I'm just looking at how much we have left. So, but that's okay. It is Friday night and I don't have to go anywhere. You really should at this point. Man. They probably. Return and revelation. Marin lingered in the steam longer than she probably should have. Though not long enough to satisfy the part of her that wanted the heat to do more than loosen the ache in her ribs and the tight, stinging pull along the healing burns. The water struck her shoulders in a steady rhythm, muffling the protected quiet beyond the refresher door and turning the small chamber hazy enough that for a little while she could almost pretend she had woken from ordinary exhaustion rather than from a healing trance beneath the weight of Emberlock, Druckenwell, Catane, and the lie that had carried her home. The illusion didn't hold. Her body wouldn't permit it. Every breath reached some tender place. Every shift reminded her of injuries still knitting themselves closed under Callista's supervision. When dizziness finally crept up through the heat and blurred the edges of the tiled wall before her, Marin shut the water off with reluctant obedience and stood still until the room stopped tilting. She dried herself slowly, taking more care than her pride preferred, and moved with the same deliberate patience back to the bunk, where she sat carefully. She tugged the coverall Jared had left over her shoulders that remained tender and eased the fabric into place where a rougher movement would have punished her. The effort sent a tremor through her limbs, and she sat down with more weight than grace, one hand closing around the edge of the mattress while she waited for her breathing to settle. A gentle knock sounded against the door to the Emberlock room. The pause that followed was brief but meaningful. The kind of pause that told her Vec had not simply allowed the door to open because someone stood outside it. He remained at the threshold even now, keeping the line between Marin's privacy and the estate's watch with the same quiet exactness he brought to everything else. Only after that silence did the door open and Jared entered. He had clearly waited nearby rather than gone far, close enough to sense when she was presentable and near enough that the room had never truly been without him. His expression softened the moment he saw her upright, though his eyes made a quick, careful assessment before the smile fully settled. He noted the color in her face, the damp strands of hair clinging to her temple, and the tension she tried to hide in her jaw, and the way one hand remained braced near her hip as though the bed might move beneath her if she let go. Jared crossed to her without haste and settled beside her, close enough to offer support without making the offer feel like supervision. "Do you need any help?" he asked softly. Her muttered "Lek" carried more stubbornness than strength, and under different circumstances she might have expected him to tease her for it. Instead, he only gave her patience. That patience undid her more effectively than argument would have. Jared knelt and reached for her boots, lacing them onto her feet with quiet care while she sat rigidly above him, caught between irritation at needing the help and the gratitude for it, without turning it into proof of weakness. When he finished, he did not rise immediately. He rested one hand lightly against her shin until she looked at him, and only then did he move back to the bed and let her lean into his embrace. Marin resisted for a breath because the resistance came easily, and then she folded against him when her body reminded her that pride had limits. Jared held her until her breathing calmed, one hand moving in slow, steady strokes along her back, and the simple repetition of the motion drew her further from the dizziness that the shower had left behind. When her tremors had eased enough that he trusted her to remain upright, Jared shifted gently and turned to face her fully. His hands found hers, not trapping them, only grounding them, and Marin felt a change in him before he spoke. The room remained warm with amber light and the lingering damp of the steam clinging to her skin, but something heavier entered the space between them. Jared's gaze flicked once toward the corridor, towards Vec's unwavering shadow beyond the sealed door, and then returned to her with the steadiness of someone who had chosen truth over delay. "Marin, it's time I told you what was going on." His voice remained low, not because the room was unsafe, but because some truths deserved to be given carefully. From the information you shared and the examination of your gear, we've pieced together their plan. You helped us there, and I questioned the one who tried to kill you. Her eyes widened before she could stop them. Memories rose too quickly, sharp-edged and immediate, bringing with it the sense of being hunted through smoke and broken light, the flash of intent from someone who had come close enough to kill, and the awful recognition that survival had not ended the danger, but merely carried it forward. Jared felt the shift through her hands and moved before the fear could gather momentum. He steadied her fingers between his own and pressed his forehead to hers, anchoring her with the gentlest covin he could offer while leaving no room for the room to tilt away beneath her again. "Easy, love. Focus. I wanted to be the one to tell you. While you rested on Catane, we came up with a plan. It's not ideal, but it's the only one. The Marines will use a duplicate of the tracker they planted in your saber to draw Deathwatch to the equatorial zone on Tanagus. Ethan says it's empty, uninhabited, far from here and the colony." Marin's breathing steadied slowly, though her lips pressed into a thin line as the meaning of his words settled into her mind. Pain and exhaustion had slowed many things, but not her mind once it found the shape of a problem. She turned the plan over, almost visibly, her blue eyes narrowing as terrain, distance, and memory aligned behind them. Tanagus was not merely a map to her. It was weather, forests, old trails, hunting grounds, ravines, storms, and the long sweep of land where a person could disappear or be found depending upon who understood the ground better. When she spoke, the protest had given way to analysis, which told Jared she had already moved past the first shock and into the responsibility she always reached for. "Lek, that zone covers thousands of kilometers, and unless I'm wrong, only 3 people know it well. Ethan, myself, and Iran. He was here long enough to learn the ground." Jared nodded and wrapped her fingers more securely around the mug of Behat waiting near the bedside. The warmth steadied her hands and gave her something solid to hold besides fear. Exactly. I suggested Iran help coordinate with the Marines there. While the Marines draw them away, your task is here, with Greer. You'll coordinate and guide. You know these forests best of any of us. She started to protest because of course she did. The instinct rose in her before her body had the strength to support it, outrage and duty gathering behind her eyes as though she could will herself into armor and movement if she simply refused the limits hard enough. Jared lifted one finger to her lips, not to silence her in dismissal, but to stop the self-sacrificing answer before it found its old path through her. The gesture was intimate enough to be gentle and firm enough to remind her that he knew the argument she had not yet spoken. Listen to me. You're still recovering, but here your role matters more than anyone's. Marin held his gaze for a long moment. The words struck where pride could not deflect them because they didn't tell her she was unnecessary. They told her the opposite. She looked down at the mug in her hands, watching steam curl upward between her fingers as the truth settled with the heaviness of something she didn't like and could not dismiss. She wanted to be in the field. She wanted movement, armor, and the clean answer of action, and the ability to meet the threat with her own hands. Wanting that didn't change the tremor still moving through her body or the way the room seemed to demand careful breathing if she moved too quickly. I know. Her voice was quieter than she intended, shadowed but resolute. I want to be out there, but I'm not ready. Jared's expression softened. He didn't celebrate the admission because he understood what it had cost her. Instead, he brushed the damp hair back from her cheek and asked the question with careful gentleness. Sensei commanded you, didn't he? And I'm going to pause there because we're about to be in an ad, my friends. Please go get yourself some water. Welcome back from the ad break, my friends. I really do hope you're going to get some water. I am doing my best to stay cool over here because it is ridiculous. Let's see if my watch says. Yeah, it's still 93. Ridiculous. But it's July, so I guess I shouldn't be surprised. At her nod, he kissed her forehead. The touch carried reassurance, but also a quiet reinforcement of the same structure holding the estate together around her. Ethan's command, Callista's oversight, Greer's coordination, Beck's threshold watch, Jared's presence beside her, and Marin's own willingness to listen despite every instinct urging her toward the fight that had become despite every instinct urging her toward the fight, had become part of one protective pattern. Then trust his wisdom. You're stubborn, Marin, but you're listening. That matters. Her breath shook, and for a moment she looked far younger than the woman who had survived Druckenwell. More like the girl who had once been asked to prove herself too early and had learned to turn fear into movement before anyone could see her hands tremble. I'm honestly dreading what Ethan will say about Druckenwell. Jared cupped her chin, his eyes steady enough to hold her there when shame tried to pull her inward. He knew Ethan's anger, if it came, would not be the kind Marin feared. Ethan had carried her too long in his own quiet way to mistake injury for failure. But he also knew that fear didn't answer to reason simply because a reason had been spoken. Focus here, love. The rest can wait. I won't be far, I promise. Beyond the door, Vex shifted just enough to ease the ache of stillness, but his gaze never strayed from the corridor. His presence remained a wall, neither intrusive nor absent, holding the threshold so that the room within could contain truth, weakness, and the difficult work of returning without exposing himself to the rest of the estate. Outside the deeper chambers, Harris and Rao reported another perimeter clear through clipped veil code that moved across the estate's guarded channels without disturbing the amber-lit quiet around Marin. The estate remained awake around them, watch layered upon watch, all of it arranged so she could sit on the edge of a bed with a mug warming her hands and hear the plan that would let her serve without sending her body back into the fire. Threads of watchfulness and quiet love braided together in the Emberlock room. Defenses set and trust affirmed, while vows spoken aloud and those carried silently held the wounded center of the estate through the hush before the next command. Sorry. Because I'm slouching again. Okay. Steel at the threshold. Emberlock antechamber. The corridor was dim, lit only by a recessed glow panel that cast a narrow amber wash across the Durasteel frame of the door to the Emberlock room, leaving the rest of the antechamber in muted shadow. The stone of the mountain held its coolness even here, despite the warmth gathered deeper within the estate, and the quiet possessed a weight that belonged to protected places. Vex stood within that half-light like something carved into the architecture itself, still and deliberate, his rifle resting against his chestplate, angled but never idle. His gauntleted hands remained settled with quiet control, one resting near the sling, the other close enough to the weapon to bring it to bear without wasted motion. Nothing in his posture suggested tension, nothing suggested ease either. He occupied the narrow space between those things, balanced precisely where years of training and experience had taught him to stand. For most men, standing guard became an exercise in endurance, a slow negotiation with boredom and wandering thoughts. For Vec, it had never been that. Watchfulness was a discipline in itself, a deliberate act of attention sharpened through repetition until it became almost meditative. Every breath he drew was measured. The faint rasp of his respirator and the subtle movement of air within his helmet settled into an old cadence that reminded him he was alive, aware, and ready. He let the silence fill him because silence was never truly empty. It carried shape if one listened long enough. The distant hum of the estate's systems, the minute shifts in temperature that accompanied cycling ventilation, the soft resonance of movement farther down the corridor. Beyond the sealed chamber door there was faint ripples of sound as well. Marin's voice, low and roughened by recovery. Jared's answering her. He couldn't hear the words through the walls, nor would he have tried to. It was enough to know that two voices moved quietly in the room beyond, finding each other in the wake of everything that had happened. He did not shift or lean towards the door. He was not stone, but sentry. The distinction mattered to him more than most people would have understood. Stone endured because it lacked choice. Stone simply existed until something greater than itself broke it apart. A sentry endured because he chose to remain where he had been placed. A sentry accepted stillness, and vigilance accepted responsibility and the possibility of sacrifice, and stood anyway. There was purpose in that choice, and purpose gave strength to things that would otherwise only be weight. Vec's gray eyes flicked once toward the corridor that led deeper into the estate. He'd heard Callista's steps earlier when she left the Amberlock chamber and sensed the subtle change in the atmosphere that accompanied her departure. She moved carefully even when she was tired, every footfall measured and economical, but there was something else about her as well. The force seemed to follow her like a current, subtle but unmistakable even to someone who didn't experience it as she did. He had seen the way Ethan looked at her when she passed, the concern hidden beneath practiced calm, the trust that existed so completely between them that words often seemed unnecessary. Katani raised, Jedi, Mandalorian trained and carrying grief like a second blade at her side. She moved through the estate with the same quiet determination he had seen in soldiers who knew there was no choice but forward. He respected that. He respected her. Earlier in the corridor, she had looked at him with in that soldier's way that needed no explanation and no reassurance. You hold here. You do not break. He had inclined his head in acknowledgement because there had been nothing more to say. His duty now was simple in description and immense in practice. He was here to hold balance, to anchor the quiet within the Amberlock chamber and stand as the last wall if anything disturbed it from without. His mind moved once more through the layout of the estate, not because he had forgotten it, but because repetition kept the pathways clear. 2 junctions beyond this corridor, 3 fallback positions if the chamber had to be evacuated, haptic communications primed and checked. Harris and Rao were working the outer perimeter. Talon was in the south corridor. Greer was in the war room already preparing contingency responses that Vec did not need to know in detail to execute his own responsibilities. The structure of it all settled comfortably in his thoughts. Command at the center, warriors at the edge, silence in between. Every person carrying their part so that no one piece of the whole had to bear the entire weight. As always, however, his awareness returned to the door. He had guided the Umbrella pod through this threshold. He had watched the transfer from pod to bed with the same care he brought to every movement involving a wounded person. He had known, before the chamber even sealed around her, how close they had come to carrying something very different through these halls. He had not flinched from the duty. Vale Marines did not have the luxury of looking away from difficult truths. Yet something within him had tightened all the same. Marin Durza carried many names and many obligations. She was a commander's daughter. She was a Jedi, a Marine, an intelligence officer, and a warrior. She was also, in that moment, simply a wounded young woman trying to find her way back from the edge of something terrible. And now she was awake again. He could hear it in the muted resonance of voices beyond the door. There was no panic, no fevered delirium, no thrashing movement against blankets and pillows. There was conversation. There was life. And there was the ordinary cadence of 2 people speaking quietly in the middle of the night because one had almost been lost and the other had refused to leave. Vec let a slow breath escape. This, too, was part of the balance he held. He reminded himself deliberately that she was no ghost. She was not another name bound into the Razatai. She was not another memorial braid woven in silence and worn by those left behind. Too many times he had stood in places like this only to watch recovery turn into mourning. Too many times he had escorted the wounded and returned carrying the dead. The work taught hard lessons. It taught a person not to assume survival simply because someone still breathed. Tonight, however, she still lived. That truth settled in him quietly and with surprising weight. Marin lived. She had survived Druckenwell. She had endured the long journey home, and she had awakened in her father's estate, surrounded by people who loved her enough to build an entire watch around her recovery. So long as that remained true, he would stand here. The glow panel overhead guttered once as the current shifted somewhere within the estate's systems. The brief fluctuation changed nothing in the corridor, but Vec marked it automatically. Another detail filed away and held in readiness should it matter later. His posture remained unchanged. His body was still, but his awareness remained a living grid of possibilities, observations, and routes. Beyond the mountain, the Tanagas night pressed close to the stone walls, wrapped in forest and mist and the deep quiet that came before dawn. Within the estate, the watch continued in measured rhythms. Somewhere below, Ethan and Greer planned. Somewhere beyond, Harris and Rel moved through the perimeter. Within the chamber behind him, Jared remained at Marin's side. And here, at the threshold between all of those things, Beck held the line. Steel at the threshold, not stone, nor shadow, but chosen. Okay. Alright, looks like my estimation of 9:30 was pretty correct. We have one scene left. Alright. I'm gonna have a bit of a stretch, because I know somebody's gonna yell at me about my posture. Oh, man. Through the static. Dorza Estate, Emberlock room. The room was quiet. Of course it was. I knew it was coming. The room was quiet, its stone walls softened by recessed glow panels that spilled a warm amber light across old wood, folded blankets, and the small collection of healer supplies Callista had arranged nearby. The air smelled faintly of herbs and medicinal tinctures, sharp green and cool, carrying the grounding scent she favored when recovery threatened to become disorientation. They cut gently through the lingering fog that still clung to Marin's thoughts, giving the room a sense of purpose rather than illness. The mountain beyond the walls remained silent, and somewhere farther down the corridor the estate kept its patient watch. But within the Emberlock chamber the world had narrowed to breath, amber light, and the difficult work of returning to herself. Marin sat on the edge of the bed with the quilt gathered around her shoulders. Her posture had not fully recovered its usual lines. Fatigue and pain pulled at her despite every effort she made to hide it, and her shoulders bowed slightly beneath burdens that had little to do with physical injury. Her fingers curled tightly around her knees as though that small, deliberate pressure could keep her anchored. The silence around her was not complete. To everyone else, the room held only the low hum of hidden systems and the occasional faint creak of settling timber. To Marin, it carried the high-pitched hiss that had followed her since Drakenwell, a phantom ringing that lived somewhere behind her eyes and at the base of her skull. It was not truly sound, and it was not entirely memory either. It seemed to pulse with each breath she took, rising and falling like static threaded through the force itself. Every time she tried to extend her awareness beyond herself, nausea lurked beneath the effort, waiting for her to push too hard. Callista knelt before her with the patient calm of someone who sat beside many wounded people and understood that healing was rarely a straight path. She moved her hands lightly, first across Marin's temple, then to the line of her jaw before brushing 2 fingers at the base of her throat. The bruises there had begun to heal. The touch was gentle, but her attention reached deeper than pulse and temperature. She was listening to the subtler things, to the uneven resonance beneath the surface, and to the lingering effects of the compound that still weighed heavily in Marin's system, and to the way her connection to the Force had become frayed and oversensitive all at once. "Steady," Callista murmured, and the word held no command within it. It was reassurance offered with the same rhythm she used while healing, as though sound itself could encourage the dizziness to settle. "The worst of it's gone, but you'll need time. Let the force breathe around you instead of forcing it through." Marin blinked slowly. Even that simple motion seemed to drag through water. Shame touched her expression for the briefest moment before she could hide it. She had endured pain before. She had fought through exhaustion, injury, and grief. This felt different. This felt like losing trust in something that had always been there. "It's loud," she admitted quietly. Her voice remained low, roughened by disuse and touched by embarrassment. "Even when it's quiet." She didn't mean the room. Callista understood that immediately. So did Jared, seated nearby in watchful silence. Marin meant the ringing in her skull and the strange static that had settled over her awareness of the Force. The sense that every silence now contained noise she could neither escape nor understand. Callista rested one hand over hers, covering fingers gone cool despite the warmth of the room. "That will fade," she said gently. "Not today, and perhaps not as quickly as you would like, but it will. Don't chase the silence, Marika. Just let it come." Oops. Sorry. Marin closed her eyes briefly. Chasing things had become a habit in her life. Chasing answers, chasing duty, chasing the next mission, the next problem, the next person in need of saving. Sitting still and allowing something to return in its own time felt far more difficult than action ever had. Callista rose slowly then, giving her enough time to absorb the words before adding more. Her gaze shifted toward the entrance of the Emberlock room. Ethan stood there, broad-shouldered in the doorway, his presence carrying its usual quiet gravity. He had remained near while Callista worked, close enough to intervene if needed and far enough away not to intrude on the healer's care. He had not crossed the room or interrupted, and he hadn't spoken. He simply watched, his attention steady the same way he watched a horizon before a storm. For a long moment his gaze remained on Marin. He was measuring, as he always did, not merely her physical state, but the way she held herself. The color in her cheeks, the strain around her eyes, and the effort it took her simply to sit upright. He had listened to Callista's reports, but reports were not the same thing as seeing for himself. At last, he crossed the room. And I'm going to pause there, because we have an ad starting in about 12 seconds. Please go get yourself some water, have a good stretch, grab a snack, whatever you need. I'll be back in a minute and a half because I'm going to do the same thing. Oh, that was over a lot faster than I expected. Oh, welcome back, my friends. We are almost done with the final scene in this chapter. I do hope that you're enjoying the story. Spent a lot of time working on these chapters, and I do hope that it's enjoyable and engaging for you. Some of them are heavier than others. That's just the nature of story writing. So. His steps were nearly soundless despite the weight he carried. He stopped beside her and set one hand briefly on her shoulder. The pressure of his hand was solid and grounding, not the touch of a healer and not entirely the touch of a father either. It felt more like what it had always been between them, the quiet steadiness of a commander reassuring one of his own. "Vodka," he murmured in Mandoa, the word reserved for her alone. "Little warrior." It carried weight because he had always used it sparingly. There was affection in it, certainly, but also recognition, a reminder that weakness in this moment did not erase everything she had endured to reach it. His thumb brushed once against the seam of her sleeve before he released her, He didn't ask how she felt. He didn't tell her she looked terrible or that she frightened everyone by nearly dying. He simply gave her that small, steadying contact and stepped away again. Marin looked up at him, and for a moment she saw the fatigue in his eyes, the concern he had spent hours setting aside in favor of planning and preparation. She realized suddenly that everyone around her had been carrying pieces of this burden while she slept. The estate had not paused because she had been unconscious. Ethan and Greer had prepared defenses. Callista had watched over her recovery. Jared had remained beside her, and Vec had guarded the threshold. The realization settled heavily and quietly within her chest. Ethan's gaze softened almost imperceptibly as he marked the understanding in her expression. Satisfied with whatever he found there, he inclined his head once and withdrew to lean against the wall. With his arms folded loosely across his chest, he resumed his place as observer and protector, close enough to step in if needed and disciplined enough not to intrude. Jared moved then. He had remained silent through the examination, giving Callista room to work and Ethan space for his quiet assessment. Now he crossed the short distance between them and crouched in front of Marin. He didn't sit opposite her like a healer asking questions. He settled slightly to one side, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, positioning himself beside rather than across from her. "Look at me," he said quietly. His voice remained low and carefully pitched so it wouldn't compete with the ringing in her ears. When her blue eyes lifted to his, uncertain and a little weary, he raised one hand between them, palm upward. "Breathe with me," he said. "Match my hand." She hesitated. It seemed absurdly simple, breathing. She had been breathing all along, yet she trusted him enough to try. Slowly, she raised her own hand and rested it against his. His palm was warm and steady, real. Jared drew in a slow breath and she tried to follow. Her lungs caught at first. The inhale was uneven, but he didn't rush her. He simply waited and breathed again. He closed his eyes and counted softly. 1. His chest rose. 2. Her breathing matched his more closely. 3. Their hands lifted and fell together. The ringing didn't disappear. The static remained, faint and persistent. It dulled at the edges, becoming less overwhelming and less like a storm consuming every single thought. "Good," Jared murmured as he opened his eyes. His thumb brushed lightly across her knuckles. "Don't fight it. Let it pass through you. Anchor here." He guided her hand gently and pressed it against his chest. Beneath her palm, his heartbeat thudded in a steady rhythm. "That's yours to hold." Marin's breath shuddered once, and then slowly it steadied. For the first time since Druckenwell, she felt something close to balance. It wasn't peace. She was too tired and too raw for that. The static remained, and the wounds within her had not vanished, but there was something she could lean into, something solid. The nausea began to ease slightly. The ringing receded into the background. She could still hear it, but it no longer filled her entire world. Her hand remained against Jared's chest, feeling the steady beat beneath her fingertips, and she realized with sudden clarity that this, too, was part of healing. Not solitude, not enduring in silence. This, being allowed to borrow steadiness until her own returned. Callista watched with quiet satisfaction, her hands folded loosely before her. There was no triumph in her expression, only the calm recognition of a small but meaningful step forward. Against the wall, Ethan tilted his head slightly. The sharpness in his eyes softened as he marked the change in Marin's posture, the easing of tension in her shoulders, and the steadier rhythm of her breathing. No one spoke. The silence that settled over the umbrella chamber no longer felt oppressive. It became something shared, a quiet held together by trust, by watchfulness, and by the patient certainty that healing, however slow, had finally begun. If you cannot carry the whole world, carry one person. That is how it begins. Durza Creed, Maxim. 28? Yes, sorry. Brain. Roman numerals are killing me. You cannot shield everything. You cannot stop every fire or close every wound, but you can choose one life and stand fast beside it. Clan is built one act of protection at a time, one body between danger and someone who needs to breathe. The bulwark is not stone or steel. It is the decision to stay. Thank you for being here in the archives with me tonight. I'm always grateful to share this space with any of you who are here, even for a little while. I hope that the rest of your evening is calm and that you have something to carry forward from tonight. Please take care of yourselves, rest well, and try to stay cool. I'll see you next time. I'm actually gonna go see... Hold on one second. Oh. Well. Oh, okay. I still can. I was gonna go raid somebody, so I had to make sure she was still alive. Oh my goodness, what is going on? Sorry, something is acting very strange. Oh boy. Come on. Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, I'm attempting to go raid Moody Paso, but yeah. For some reason, Twitch is being a pain in the rear end. So I'm gonna try this anyway. And see if it behaves. Might have to load it up on a different browser. Okay, wait just a moment. Am I? Am I? Are you sure? Are you sure about that? Give me just a moment while I take care of this. I promise I'm not slouching. I'm just leaning forward a little bit. Okay, yeah, for whatever reason, for whatever silly... Oh my word. Yeah, for whatever reason, my normal browser that I use for Twitch is being super cranky, so I had to load it on a different browser. Alright, my friends, I would greatly appreciate if you could hang around for that raid. Yes, that is exactly what those do. That's why they're there. There to have fun. And scare the crap out of me at the same time. Yes. For anybody who is subscribed to the channel, please feel free to grab... Please feel free to grab this first message. Oh my goodness. My word. Wow, stuff is being really weird. My computer is having a seizure. Thank you, Wicked. Hi, Wicked, also. By the way, thank you. I'm having a bit of technical issues right here at the end. So thank you for that assist, Wicked. And we are gonna go say hi to Moody Paso. It is her 60th birthday, apparently, which is super cool. Yes. So we are going to go say hi. So let me do... Oh gosh. I have to do... I can't do streamer things today, apparently. Let's try this again. I'm having trouble doing streamer things. Okay. Yes, we're gonna go bye-byes. We're gonna go say hi to Moody Paso. She's pretty amazing. And, end our night with her. You sure? Okay. Yeah, if I seem a little bit more discombobulated than normal for those who were not here at the beginning of stream, it has been a very long week. And yesterday was incredibly long. So, please bear with. Of course it's not what you think of. Anyway. Let's go say hi to Moody Paso. Thank you again for everybody who was here, whether you were lurking in the background and keeping things chill, or hanging out and being silly. Either way is perfectly acceptable. I appreciate you. And I hope that you guys have an awesome rest of your start to your 4th of July. Please stay cool, drink that water, take those meds, and generally take care of yourself. Have a good night, everybody. We'll see you next time.